it raises a point that I think we're at a very critical point as a country. My view is that if we don't do certain things which fundamentally change the trajectory, both economically, socially, and otherwise of the country, we're heading for a very serious trouble. But unfortunately, I think we seem to be talking past each other or talking alongside each other. I think the conversation we must gradually drive towards, firstly, creating a shared perspective of where we are as a country. We probably need to drive discussion towards a consensus on a package of broad economic reforms across the economy, broadly speaking. I read Andre Roux's paper quite intensely, and I think it's a very good paper. It touches on the issues. I agree with his articulation of the four deficits that it talks about, and I agree with most of the points. In fact, if you get some of the Treasury presentations, then they probably say pretty much the stuff that you're saying. So it's very clear that if you look at it from a fiscal perspective, everybody seems to be very clear that a couple of things need to be happening. Firstly, it's very clear from a contextual perspective that counter-cyclical stimulus has no space or has very little space in the current environment, with looking at the growth levels into the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So all of us agree around that. You know, there's no contestation around that. Secondly, I mean, there's a broad agreement that we need to rein the growth of the debt. I mean, at the moment, debt service costs are probably the fastest rising component of our budget. And I think in our budget, in the budget statement, the Minister made it very clear that we've got to manage this stabilized debt to GDP ratio and actually turn this around. But secondly, I think we're also very clear that, I'll come back to this point, but we're also very clear that we've got to manage public expenditure. And I think we've introduced an expenditure ceiling and said that whatever happens, we are not going to break the ceiling. We'll stick to that ceiling because we believe that it fits into the broader fiscal framework that we are developing. So that's important that we maintain that. If you take all the debates and arguments that have been, and in the paper that Andre wrote, probably one of the deficits of the paper is the issue of state capacity. You know, because I mean, and I'm saying this thing upfront, that it's something that we probably need to deal with. And the easiest way of looking at state capacity, I know everybody would say state-owned enterprises. That's probably the easiest and the most glaring one. How do we ensure that these entities are geared towards delivering a better service? How do we build a different partnership between government and private sector in the delivery of services? Now, the debate about what role the state should play and what role a private sector should play, I think on all sides has been overly ideological. Our metros and cities are going to be engines for growth, whether we like it or not. Now, again, it's another missing debate. How do we make our metros and cities become the real engines for growth? What do we need to do? In Treasury, we would argue that one of the things that we need to do is to almost come up with a different fiscal package for cities. Because at the moment, our cities plan their infrastructure on 5-year cycles. It doesn't make sense. I think we need to have them thinking more medium, long term about their infrastructure. But also in the financing model for that infrastructure, you actually have a model that allows for a combination between private and public funding of that infrastructure in a manner that we have not done up to now. You know. It's also the other element, elephant in the room is inequality. Because I think, for me, and there's now, I think, IMF and World Bank and OECD studies that demonstrate, of course, that inequality has a potential to constrain growth. You know, so if we do not, so it's not a matter of arguing, as we have argued all along, that if you have growth, you address inequality. Now, in the medium long term, obviously, education is a fundamental tool to deal with, inequality. I think the issue now that confronts South Africa is taking the conversation beyond the access question and dealing with quality issues and equity issues in education and in all other social services that we have. For me, the question is going to be, what do we need to do? Because if you look at unemployment in South Africa, it shows you very clearly that the problem is with the low-skilled and the unskilled. And if you look at the policy propositions on the table, they tend to focus on a high-growth path with high skills, et cetera, and missing the problem. And there are a number of reasons for that. Some are political, some are ideological, but I think the reality should come home that we need to confront the issue of how do we ensure that the low-skilled and are brought into the labor market at a scale beyond what we are doing now. But I think if you look at the nature of South African middle class, quite frankly, it's a very small middle class in comparative terms. If you think about the total population of the country, our middle class is very small. What we're compromising is what happens elsewhere, where you have a big middle class, entrepreneurial, innovative, et cetera, which you don't have at the moment. And where you see a lot of innovation, it's interesting because I seem to think in the informal sector, you see a lot of innovation happening than generally at the level of the middle class, where we need to have more of that. Unfortunately, that is not connected with the mainstream economy. And the pathway of that connection is not almost there, as it were. So something needs to be done around that. But the point I'm just making is that we do need, and I concur with the view that innovation is fundamental. I also concur with the view that we have to do something drastic about our education system. You know, a couple of years ago, I think 3 years ago, I wrote a paper about the state of our education. And it was, and I think we must concur that at the level of access, we've done very well, actually. We almost have we're nearing a point where there's schooling for all. The reality is that I think access movements have one failure globally, and the failure is quality. And I think that's where we need to shift. And it's a painful debate also because, let's face it, we have an over-unionized education system. In fact, there's an interesting research I read some time ago which shows you that the more unionized your education system, the lower your education outcomes. And my last point is about this thing of an economic package, a broad economic package. And I think somebody recently called it the big bargain. That I think we will be stuck where we are, I believe, and until actually we start thinking very hard about where we need to compromise, the way we used to do things, change the trajectory of development, where we need to really change policy. How do we enforce coherence in policy? But central to that big bargain is a more creative and innovative partnership between government and the private sector, which is very fundamental. It's a very important element of what we need to do. If you take the example of education, you can even take health, you can take infrastructure delivery, etc. My sense is that if we can improve the levels of efficiency, the impact that we'll be making is very huge. But if also we can restructure the way our budget is at the moment, and I think it's something that we currently focused on as Treasury, to try to gradually shift the structure of budget, it will have a huge impact. We believe that I think if borrowing continues, it should be directed towards capital expenditure. Because then you can actually verify the outcome of what you're doing. Can I say thank you very much?